It is time for me to be able to give you an end of the year review. I read, I think, 135 books total. I compiled my top favorites for you. I'm going to do this by category. So I'm going to start with classics. The Lark. I had just found out about this book recently. This book was written in 1922. It's about two cousins, very young women, like 18 and like 20 or something like that. They take over a guest house. They had grown up in a boarding house and now they're like, well, what are we going to do? When they move where they go to, they meet so many different people, some that are helpful, some that are not so helpful. And it's really funny. If you like some humor and beautifully written work, this one is perfect for you. There is a tiny bit of romance in it as well. It also puts you in a beautiful setting. You think about flowers, you think about England, and you have that whole idea of class as well intertwined. A Tree Grows in Brooklyn. This one is actually my mother-in-law's favorite book, and so I said I would read it for her, and I had been wanting to for several years, and I finally did, and I was not disappointed. There is a lot of story in this. It is about family. Overall, it is about how a young girl perseveres in poverty in New York City and how she's able to overcome that through education. This was written in 1943. There's a lot of raw situations in this, so it might be a little bit heavy for some people, but there's so much beauty in the realism of what life would have been like for an immigrant family growing up, specifically a first and second generation immigrant. It's just really good. I know in one of my videos I had said that I had been reading this or I just finished this, and maybe I talked a little bit about it, but I had never read Sense and Sensibility until now. And I had wanted to read all of Jane Austen's books. I am a late Jane Austen person. This was my third book that I read by her. The other ones I read like last year, so I'm really new. This is about a family that has to live, again, in sort of a poverty situation. Not really, but they lose their fortune when a certain man dies in the family. So they have to live out of the goodness of people giving them what they can. And it focuses mainly on two sisters. There are three, but it focuses on the older two. You have Eleanor and Marianne. They're very different in their personalities. Marianne is very much attached to the idea of romance and love and being swept off her feet. You have the idea that these sisters are Sense and Sensibility. One of them wants to be able to do her duty and do her best without showing great emotion and hoping that things just work out, but she's willing to be patient. So that's Eleanor. She is the one that abides by the law. And then of course there are those who are their love interests. And it's just really, oh my, her writing really moves you to tears at times, and it makes you laugh other times. You feel what they feel. There's something in the way that people wrote books long ago that just enrapture your heart and capture it, and you just feel, and it's just like, I want to do all these things because I want to help these people and I want to make them communicate, and you become a part of this story. This book was written in 1924. I had heard about this. I had seen the movie from the 70s actually, so I'd already known what it was about, and I had been wanting to read it for a while. So I was really glad I did. I know it's set in a very strange time period. If you think about how India was basically Pakistan and India at that time in the 20s. It was combined. So it was before you had everything that split them apart. So you have in this story the idea that Muslims and Hindus, they lived for the most part in harmony, not completely. And then you had colonization from the British in this area. So this story gives you that sense of idea. You have the main character who is a Muslim man living in India, and he is a doctor. And then you have this older woman and a middle-aged woman who are English women visiting and wanting to see what actually India is like. They want to see the real India. And so this doctor is all excited because most people that go there, they just want to be with all the colonizers, not the mixture. And so they take a journey that changes their lives completely. And I can't get into what that is. There are definitely some aspects in this book that might trigger people that have certain things that they don't like to read about or hear about. I don't want to give away spoilers. Really feel for the doctor, especially. And I love that the author wanted to give you that. I think he wanted to really pinpoint to those in that time period around him that people in India were real people that mattered. Now I want to get into some fantasy books. This one is an author I've heard about so many times. I've never read his books. And I know that in a way, this is like a standalone, but it could also be a part of a larger series that he has. I was told when I got into this by a friend, she said, "Oh, do you know that this is basically written as if The Princess Bride was instead through a woman's perspective and giving it as if the woman was like the dread pirate Roberts." And that changed my whole perspective of how I read this. Trust of the Emerald Sea is about a young woman that goes on a quest to try to help someone that she really is deeply in love with. And he is of a higher class than her. She is basically meets a bunch of pirates, goes on an adventure, makes friends along the way, and is able to find love. But this is slightly science fiction because it's as if they're on another planet. There's a whole bunch of like mushrooms and stuff, and it's a very strange planet and world. So that was interesting to me. I have not read science fiction in a while, so it was like a fantasy science fiction mixture. The Wishing Game. Oh man, this was a fun one. It was like Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, but with an author that lives on an island in Maine, and he actually knows certain children that are now full adults. They are sent to his island to play a game. But there's also this orphan boy involved in it because he has a teacher who wants to adopt him. They've read all of the books. His teacher goes to this game and she wants to win it for the boy that she doesn't really have the money to adopt, but really loves him dearly. So it's all about these different characters and how they can solve some clues and play these games in order to see if they can win a prize. It's very fun. Twilight Falls is part of the Shady Hollow series, which I have talked about before. If you don't know what they are, they're a bunch of critters. They're living as if they're, personification, as if these critters can actually speak, and they live like humans, and they're civilized. They live in a forest, and there is a fox that is a reporter, and there is a cop bear. This was actually my second favorite of the whole series. The first book was my favorite, but this is great. This is where they decide, the cop and the reporter go on a picnic together. There are falls, famous falls that they like to picnic under, and there is a supposed murder that has taken place that they want to solve. They do their best to figure it out. There was a lot of good development in this one, and that's what I really like, because everything, I'm like asking myself questions and then they're answering them for me. And I thought that was really good. I like how they tied everything together. So if you didn't guess already, we are in the mystery section of my reviews. Agatha Christie, I've been reading through all of these. The main character is Hercule Poirot. I can never say his name, and I know I've done this before. So this was written in, I believe, the 30s, maybe the late 20s. There's this one woman, her name is Nick. She invites Hercule Poirot to her estate that she really wants to have him understand how important this estate is to her. She says that someone's out there to kill her. He believes that her life is threatened, and she says, "Can you please protect me?" So there is a murder that he has to solve, and it is very well done. This was a really interesting one. I can't even talk about what happens in this because, these murder mysteries, you just can't say. But this was definitely one of my top ones that I've read of Agatha Christie, and I've read about 10 now. Speaking of solving mysteries, this one I read around Christmas time. As you could see, Most Wonderful Crime of the Year was hilarious. I laughed while reading this. It was very cute. You have these two authors are invited to another author's house for Christmas, and they're spending time with her family. They're like, okay, well, we don't know why we're here, but we're here. And these two do not like each other. According to the woman who says we hate each other throughout like most of the book, there is something that happens that they know where they each were at that time. So they're like, well, we better stick together because we know that we're not the suspects. In doing that, they both like to write thriller and mysteries. So the two of them join forces to be able to solve the crime. So I reviewed M is for Mama, I think last year, might have been the year before. I'm not really certain, but I read this book earlier in this year, and this was by the same author. It's another parenting book. The person that wrote this book has like 10 kids, and so she gives a lot of great advice things that you could learn from. Just how she handles different stages of motherhood was very inspiring. So she gives lots of different stories and aspects to try to encourage other people who are mothers. I really appreciate when people say their struggles so that way you can learn from them and hopefully not make the same mistakes they make. She was really loving to all the mothers out there, and I really love her voice. You could feel like you're in a room with her and she's being so understanding of who you are. This book was very eye-opening. It talked about so many different topics of being a parent, how you can understand how to raise your kids in a biblical sense, how to have connections with your children, how to talk to them openly about various things that they're going to need as they grow. It was very nice. I enjoyed it so much that I think I have to reread this again, and I don't really reread books often because I think I could get more out of it. There are just so many good reminders that I should have been like, I gotta remember this and this and this and this. It was so good. Also, the mom is a crunchy mom, which I'm pretty much a crunchy mom too. So I like that, where she's into sustainability. This book, I actually went to the library, found the third book, didn't know it was a third book to a series. So I had to bring it back and I had to get the first book. What I love about this book is that you have one family, but in two different timelines. So they go back and forth between a more present day compared to around World War II. This book is very much Mennonite and Anabaptist. So if you have seen my Mennonite videos and you know what a Mennonite is, this gives a lot of the teachings and how to live it out. So you have a Mennonite woman who is sent into Germany while the war is just beginning there. And she sees all these other Mennonites that are taking stances with the Nazis. And it does not make sense for how Mennonites are about loving your enemy and your neighbor and to help the oppressed. It was very good because you also have this young woman, there's tragedy that hits her family. And she's learning this story from a relative who is Amish, and she herself goes to Germany to meet her family there, and she learns why it's important to fight against oppression. So I really loved it. Do you ever read books that are extremely similar but very much different and you love them both anyway? So I'm going to just talk about two books that I read a month apart, not even a month apart, and I had no idea they were going to be so similar, and the setting is so different. The similarities are just weird. So you have Leftover Woman. This could trigger certain people in different ways. This book is about a woman who is married off when she's quite young in China to a man. She finds out pretty much in the beginning of the book that her child that she was told was dead upon birth is not dead. She is adopted. And it's due to the one child policy. And she wants to find her child. And so she goes to escape China as an illegal immigrant to New York City in order to find her child. It doesn't just talk about her story, it also talks about the adopted mother's story. You get both sides of their stories in different ways. And so the whole book is about motherhood. There's little twists here and there. Like I started to pick up on it pretty quickly, but there are some twists and you're like, oh, okay. It wrapped up very interestingly. That being said, I loved this book. And I was like telling my husband all about it. I was like, oh, this was amazing. And then someone sends me the Foundling. One of my pen pals sent me this. And I was like, oh, okay. I actually read another book by Stacey Halls that I enjoyed. I would like to read this. All right, so I read it. And it's a historical fiction set in England during the 1700s, and the Foundling was an actual place that existed where if you were a woman that couldn't really provide for your child in the streets, instead of abandoning your child on the side of the street and letting it die, or it dies so young because you can't afford to give food, you're able to give it to this hospital and they will raise it not like how a workhouse would raise it, but actually raise it with care and educate them so they could have good jobs and good lives. And the mother, if she wants to, could come collect her child at any time and pay a fee in order to get their child back. So this is about a young woman who gives birth when she's 18 years old, and she goes back in 6 years to collect her daughter, who someone already took this daughter in her name. And so now she wants to go find where her daughter is as she goes looking for her. If you have read this and Leftover Woman, you will find right away some of the similarities of how things go on between them. It is just very, very strange because they're completely different stories, but they have it's so similar. So I suggest, if you want to do what I did and read both of these, now you guys know that there's similarities, but I went into it not knowing anything. But I loved it, and it was written as if it was an old book. So I love how the descriptions, I felt like I was living in that time. I really felt the pain at times, and I was just like, I cried once in a while, and I was like, what is wrong with me? It was good. I'm not going to talk deeply about these next books, but I read certain ones about simple living, decluttering, and just having a slow life and what that means or looks like. So there are certain books I'm just going to show you, and you can look into them if you'd like, but I loved these books. So Wabi Sabi, it's a beautiful book, has really good things about a Japanese lifestyle and slowing down. Making Space, Clutter Free, another one to inspire you of getting rid of your stuff that you don't need and making space for what matters. Minimalista, this one is a beautiful book. It has lots of photographs on the side, but it's a huge book, and the writing's like pretty small, but I read the entire thing. I was just like, was really into it. But also it's about decluttering and living your life. Home Detox, this book I own, and I don't own hardly any books at all. So this one I keep going back to. This is so good. Now, I already have been making my own cleaners. I don't like having things that are toxic in my home, but this book was so inspiring. It gives you so much information for how you can detox your home from poisonous things that you don't even realize you have. Just like this woman that goes around trying to help people just detox their home and how their health gets improved. It's just amazing. Oh man, I was so inspired by this book. It helped me to get rid of certain things that I didn't realize were toxic in my home. Just some fiction books, just 2 of them for you. So Sweet Bean Paste, I loved this book. It is set in Japan, written by a Japanese author. These 3 characters, but mainly 2, where you have an old woman. She comes to visit this young man who has his own stall for food that he makes, and she wants to work there. And he could tell that her hands aren't that great. He's like, I don't know, you're really old and your hands look very brittle. I don't know if you can really make what I need. But he learned so much from her, and she learned so much from him. And in that, you learn in depth about what these characters, what their lives are like, and this young schoolgirl becomes a part of it as well. There's stuff that I wish I could mention, but it's a big theme in this book, and it's got historical fiction involved in it, so you get some history. It was just so beautiful. The story of friendship and learning about people that maybe most people would look down upon. In Ivy Hill Christmas, I actually read this at the it was like my first book that I read in 2024. I remember the main character. He is very careful about his romantic life, but his mother wants to set him up. But he's like, I don't want to hurt people, because he had been hurt in different ways in his own life. He had issues with his father growing up. So this is a beautiful redemption story, I guess you could say. I really enjoyed this. It was beautiful. And the next 2 books are going to be informational books that I really loved learning from. So As Long as Grass Grows is for us to learn about Indigenous peoples and First Nations peoples, depending on where they are, what they go through, what their lives are like. It talks about the pipeline. I think it is a very important book, and I really loved it. Yonder Come Day. So I've read dozens of books about the Atlantic slave trade and some survivor tales for those who came out of the Civil War period that were put in slavery. This book is actually set on accounts that were taken years ago, but they tried to do it through a lens of a white person in the past. So they had to redig through these stories to bring out what these people actually went through that survived when the Emancipation Proclamation went through and these people were freed, and what their lives were like. It really highlights one person, but it also brings up other people, and it is brutal. This is a hard book to get through. You don't understand how many times I had to stop because I started crying. It was awful in the way that we should be upset when we read this. We should be upset. It really shook me to my core. And I'm tearing up just thinking about what some of these people went through and how hard it was for them. So such a good book. It should be a must read for all people that want to learn about that time period and what people went through. And when you hear some people say, oh, well, some of the slaves were treated well, and what that actually meant for those who were real slaves, compared to the white people that thought they were treating their slaves well and weren't. So this is a great book. My last two books are biographies, and it's so weird because I used to constantly read biographies, and there are only two this year that I really loved, so I wanted to just talk about those. So Know My Name. If you guys know about the Brock Turner case that was a few years ago, it's a horrific situation. He was a college student for Stanford. He was going to be a big swimmer in the Olympics, and he had been arrested, and it turned out that there was a woman that he assaulted sexually. So this is a very hard to read book for those who might be triggered by sexual abuse. It is an awful thing that happened. You know, when I read the news, we only heard that there was a woman that was assaulted. We didn't know anything about her. So she tells her entire story for you of what went on and what her life was like before and what her life was like after everything and through everything, from her examination through the trials and how she had to cope through all the awful things that were said about her, as if she was the one that wanted these things to happen to her, when no, none of that was the case. And so I loved her story, but it was hard to read. She's gone through a lot, and I think it's an important thing to understand that perspective. It was hard, but it was really good. My last book. Now, I need to tell you guys, I know this woman. So Bethany Joy Lenz, she was in the TV show One Tree Hill. This book has nothing to do with that show, really. It's in it slightly, but I wanted to read this because as I knew her as Joy Lenz, I went to high school with her. She was a senior my freshman year. I went to a Christian high school. It's funny because my middle school best friend that I had is the sister of Joy Lenz's best friend. I had interactions with her. I don't think she would even remember those interactions, but every interaction I had was really good. And I tried to just keep my distance. She had not been famous yet, but she was on like the Guiding Light soap opera, and she was on Pepsi commercial that I remember. And so I went to school with her in 1998, 1999. She graduated in 1999. And then she was in this TV show in 2003 as a high schooler, when she had already been out of high school for like 4 years or something like that. It's always so weird for me to see her around. Like when I first saw her on a billboard for a show, I was like, whoa, I know her. I want to say before I go into this quick review is that I think knowing her and seeing what she's like in real life, even though she was so young, it made me understand her better and know who she is, and to understand like the writing that she put out there. I hear her voice. I see her in front of me. This was one of the best books I read all year. She was in a cult. And again, I went to a Christian high school, so she was raised very similarly to me. Got involved in something that she thought was good for her. She thought it was going to build her spiritual life. So she is a Christian. She was put through manipulation, and someone that she trusted ended up using her, taking advantage of her. So she kept journals from that time. And so this book is completely from her journals and her memory and her heart. And she does not like say anything bad about anyone. And she does her best to show love. Like, it made me feel for her, and to be like, I'm so sorry you went through all this, like all these things that you shouldn't have had to have gone through. It's definitely affected her, but she's come out really beautifully from it. Joy Lenz, if you remember me, it's fine if you don't. I mean, when you're 14, 15 compared to someone that's 17, 18, they don't really want to interact much with you anyway. So I would have totally have been her friend. I was the weird girl, and I left that school after freshman year because it was so horrible. I saw her alone a lot, and I felt like she was the weird girl. And so that's why I felt drawn to her. I try not to interact too much with her. But there was one time where she went towards me and just started playing her guitar on a pier, because our whole school went to this beach trip, and she just played Tears in Heaven. She sang it while I was sitting on the pier, and I had already been there. And I said to her, like, that was really beautiful. And she just kept playing, and I left her alone, and I was just enjoying the view. So there's one memory for you that I had. When a whole school can go to the beach in New Jersey, that's a pretty cool thing. I guess she was pretty lonely, and I could see it and I could feel it in this book. I think she's a beautiful person inside and out. I love this book. So guys, thanks so much for being here. And it is getting darker. I don't have any other lights other than natural light coming through here. So those were the best books of 2024 that I read, some of them that came out in this year. And now on to 2025, where I have not a big list that I want to read, but I definitely want to get through a lot of books. If I could get through 135 books in a year, I'm hoping I could do that again. We'll see. This is the second most books that I've ever read in a year. Let me know what your favorite books, and if you've ever read any of these books, let me know if you have, what you thought of them. Maybe you hated these books. Maybe you're like, I never heard of any of these books, but I want to read some of them. I don't know. Whatever it is, I'd love to hear what you read, what your favorite books, maybe a top 5 books list that you could give me in the comments. So thank you guys, and I'll see you next year with the next review.